It's very rare that we find actual disinformation or misinformation. It's usually much more insidious, also because the notion of truth is so twisted, right? Mm-hmm. One of the issues I have with the term fake news is that it implies that there's true news, whereas news, like all other information, is the product of human work, and therefore it is going to have biases and values embedded in it that make it impossible for it to 100% reflect reality as it is. Now, does that mean there's lies out there? Sure. But say that there is a true news source belies the fact that we're all human beings who look at the world through a lens.
Have you been feeling disconnected, worried, or overwhelmed in life, or when you look at the state of our country and the world? If so, you're not alone. I'm right there with you, and you're in the right place. Hi, friends. Welcome to the Connected Way podcast. I'm your host and minister of connection, Rev Dev. I believe that connection is the healing path forward for us as individuals and as a collective. So on this podcast, we will explore all things connection. Connection to self, to others, to the land, and spirituality. But specifically in season 1, we are looking at the coming election through the lens of connection. How we can get informed and involved in politics and this election in digestible and engaging ways. How our spiritual and cultural beliefs and values intersect with and inform politics. How this election fits in with the larger evolution of our society, and how we can actually connect with people in these polarizing times. I know that connection has the capacity to move the needle in this election and in our individual and collective evolution. May it be so. Let's get into it. Hey, everyone. As you all know, if you've been listening to the podcast, one of the themes that has come up many, many times, and especially in the conversation with my Republican uncle in episode 14, and the discussion with Craig Freshley about having conversations across the aisle in episode 15, is the fact that many of us are dealing with very different versions of the truth. There is definitely some straight up lying going on, but there is also a fair bit of manipulation and twisting of the truth and facts, which results in different versions of the truth. We also have talked on the podcast, and especially in episode 5 with Andrew Zaro, about voting, that there is some straight up disinformation that is voter suppression tactics. And throughout the past many years, I cannot count how many times I've heard the terms fake news, misinformation, and disinformation. But I've never really quite sussed out what the distinction is between them. And it's really upsetting to me that politicians and even journalists can straight up lie about things. But I've also become very intrigued by how much power the media has in influencing the truth and reality of different people, depending on what they're listening to, watching, and consuming. And so today, we are speaking to 2 experts who can help us untangle this web a bit to understand misinformation and disinformation and how different perspectives and perceptions of fact impact people, communities, and cultures. So let me introduce you to our 2 very, very qualified guests, both professors at the University of Maine. Judith E. Rosenbaum is Associate Professor of Media Studies and Chair of the Department of Communication and Journalism at the University of Maine. Judith conducts research into people's use of digital media content and how this usage interacts with and impacts their identities, relationships, and perceptions of reality. She has examined topics such as social media and democracy, spoilers, enjoyment and media selection, news literacy and fake news, dating preferences and online dating apps, fascinating, and the impact of sharing behaviors in online environments using qualitative as well as quantitative methods. Her work has appeared in publications such as Media Psychology, Communication Research, Psychology of Popular Media Culture, Communication Teacher, and Journal of Media Psychology. Her first book, Constructing Digital Cultures, Tweets, Trends, Race, and Gender, appeared in Lexington in 2018. And in 2020, she co-edited a volume entitled Twitter, the Public Sphere, and the Chaos of Online Deliberation. Oof. In 2024, she co-authored a textbook on computer-mediated communication. Wow, Judith, so glad you're here.
Yeah.
And our second guest, Liliana Herkova, who goes by Lily, is an associate professor of communication at the University of Maine, Orono. While she continues to be deeply rooted in her home connections, her story of migration has been growing its own complicated tendrils over the last 20 plus years of loving, living, and working in the United States. Lily is committed to learning, mothering, baking, and being with nature as spiritual vocations. In her academic life, she researches the power of relationships and critical engagement with difference to transform learning, as well as the mundane, taken for granted communication that creates such experiences. Fascinating. Through story and culture-centered inquiry, she wonders about the making, unmaking, and remaking of identities, connections, and communities, and of social change as a verb. Wow. Two fascinating and very qualified guests to be talking to us here today. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so let's jump right in. Can you please define for us what misinformation and disinformation are, if they are different, and how they differ from fake news?
That's a really great question. So we tend to think about information as a binary, right? It's either correct or incorrect. But information is really a continuum where we judge the information based on whether it is deceiving or not and whether it's intending to deceive. So regular information is mostly accurate and does not mean to deceive, right? Misinformation is information that is inaccurate, but that is spread without the intention to deceive or sometimes with. So it's like you're not quite sure something is true, but you're sharing it anyway. So that's misinformation. So if someone says, Hurricane Milton is not as big a deal as we think it is because they think it's true, but it's actually wrong, that's misinformation. Disinformation is information that's incorrect and that you spread with the intent of deceiving. So you know it's wrong and you're going to pass it on anyway. Fake news it's kind of a misnomer. There's all kinds of mis and disinformation, right? There's straight up propaganda. There's mistakes, like newspapers make mistakes. There's also like clickbait is a form of misinformation, but so is the Today Show, right? Like satire and parody. So when we say fake news, we're often really referencing misinformation. So where news stations make a mistake and aren't aware of it. There are examples of fake news that is spread on purpose by news organizations. And I might be like a Pollyanna here. Most news organizations really do try their best at providing the correct information.
Got it. So there's actually a helpful sort of alliteration in there, I guess, which is that disinformation is purposely deceptive.
Exactly.
Whereas misinformation is not purposely deceptive.
Exactly. Yep.
Got it. Okay.
I think in some cases can be obvious about it, like the onion would be there purposefully set up. That would be misinformation, correct?
Yes. Although it is interesting because they are spreading it on purpose, right? And they know it's false, but their intent is not to deceive you, right? Their intent is to laugh.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, that's confusing. Okay, got it. And the fake news distinction, I think, is great because you're saying it seems like it's sort of this umbrella term that's getting thrown around all the time.
Right.
And like you've said, hopefully most media outlets are not intending to deceive with disinformation. So because it's helpful to have the distinction, can you give us some examples of misinformation and disinformation, like in general?
Well, the other day I was listening to a program, so the Commonwealth Club of California, and they had a conversation with a journalist who has written a recent book on immigration, and I should have checked his name because right now it's escaping me. He's an NPR journalist, and he was talking about how the idea of the book came from the replacement theory. So the replacement theory, the idea that immigrants are coming for everything good in America, and mostly non-white immigrants, and that's a bad thing. And there is also other kind of associated stereotypes and hurtful, discriminatory ideas associated with it. That would be, to me, an example of disinformation if it is promoted by political actors, by if it's promoted by news media outlets, for instance. But what he was saying is that he thought the kind of the urgency of the book was in responding to the popularity of this replacement theory. And he was affirming the validity of the popularity of the theory, not the rightness or wrongness of it, or the correctness or incorrectness of it. So basically he was saying, because this is taking hold in society, it's something that we need to be addressing. And the person who was interviewing him was asking, well, by addressing it, are you not like circulating it further and therefore making it even more popular? And so he spoke then for the responsibility of journalists when addressing something that is taking hold and is shaping action and it's bringing people together, that, you know, ignoring it is not going to go away, but how we address it and what we present as kind of the diversity of realities related to it could change.
When we think about fake news and misinformation, we think about a tweet that I actually saw yesterday where a politician in the South said that we do control the weather. And, you know, that's clearly we don't control the weather. Like, you know, like humans, I mean,
that's a wild statement.
we impact climate. We don't control hurricanes, right? So it's very rare that we find actual disinformation or misinformation. It's usually much more insidious, also because the notion of truth is so twisted, right? One of the issues I have with the term fake news is that it implies that there's true news, whereas news, like all other information, is the product of human work, and therefore it is going to have biases and values embedded in it that make it impossible for it to 100% reflect reality as it is. Now, does that mean there's lies out there? Sure. But, you know, to say that there is a true news source, like, belies the fact that we're all human beings who look at the world through a lens.
Right. Which I think is such an important point, because it really is like we all have our own perception of the truth or perception of facts that makes up our version of the truth, right? And so it's such a complicated thing, and especially right now, because it seems to be rampant in the media that there are different perceptions of facts that are being taken by different sides and spun in different ways. Like I think about, I guess the two main examples that I can think of right now that you can both speak to about, like, what exactly is this? Is this misinformation? Is it disinformation? What is it? Is like the situation with Springfield, Ohio was quite egregious, with there being, quote unquote, I wouldn't even call them facts, because they're not, to me, they were lies, where, you know, Trump and Vance were talking about people from Haiti that had come and were Haitians living in Springfield, Ohio, eating their pets, or eating pets of people in Springfield, Ohio, which was like proven to be not true. So is misinformation a lie? Are lies misinformation? Is there a connection between lies and misinformation? What's the distinction there, I guess?
I mean, that's a really good question. A lie is you're aware that you're lying, right? And you're spreading that lie with the purpose of convincing somebody of something. So then it would be, in my take, a form of disinformation.
Yes, right.
Lily, I don't know. I think you probably have some good takes on that too, about how that kind of information just creates this alternative reality.
Yeah, I would love to hear, Lily, about, I mean, we can use that example, or we can talk about another example about how that then impacts people, how disinformation can take hold, what the impacts are, and all of that.
Yeah, I think part of it is that this could be exactly the intention behind it, right? Behind spreading a lie or twisting facts in certain ways, spinning them a certain ways. So when we think about that intentionality, it's not just, oh, my purpose is to lie. No, my purpose is to lie so that I can, you know, rile up my people, right? So that I can convince somebody that they need to take a certain action and so on. And I think that's part of the definition of disinformation, is that, right, that there has to be a certain, you're thinking beyond the words and beyond what is being said, but you're like really thinking about the impacts of it and what you want to produce. What do you want to create with your words? Which, I don't know. We think a lot about that, but
right.
I don't know if,
right. Because what you're talking about a lot is intent. Like you're talking about the difference between intent and impact, and like someone can have bad intent is where it becomes disinformation if they're intending to create something with information that is not true. Whereas misinformation, there is not that intent, but it can also have a bad impact. So yeah, there's an interesting line there. Yeah, and then the other one that's come up really recently, and again, we can, share what you want about this, but with Hurricane Helene, there's a lot of, and I think because it's just so top of mind, it's almost a good example of looking at how this affects people. Like there's a lot of information coming out on the right that's like about how the government is not supporting people. And then on the left, it's like how the government is supporting people and how scary it's going to be if Trump gets rid of FEMA. And so it's like this sort of battleground of how do we take facts and then turn them to our advantage, which is also what a lot of campaign videos are and ads, is like taking facts and spinning them and then like throwing them out so that people get upset. And it's just this sort of riling up using total spins of the truth, or facts, I should say, because truth is a complicated word in this situation. Yeah. So I mean, for me, it feels like some of it, I don't even know if you would call that disinformation. Would you call it disinformation, or would it just be like a spin?
It's a really complicated topic, especially I think what complicates things is that folks get their information from social media, right? Like back in the day, we used to all watch the news at 6:30 and we'd all get the exact same information. And there was no way to get images out of North Carolina or images out of Tennessee, except when you watch the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. And now what you see is that people get information from their contacts on their social media feeds, where they exist in echo chambers, right? We connect with people we like, who think like us. And so one person might share, that the emergency funds that folks get from FEMA is only a loan. And someone else will repost that or retweet that and say, see, FEMA isn't doing anything. And there's no fact checking. There's also no verification with other sources. And so these people who share that information genuinely believe that it's true, because there's no longer that tendency that there used to be to go turn on the national news and see what they have to say. I mean, and there's problems with mainstream news media, in a variety of ways as well, but at least they have journalistic integrity and fact-checking sources. And so folks are spreading information without really knowing if it's true or not, and oftentimes without really caring, because it fits in the narrative of how they view reality.
I think also relevant to that is that we think about, so for example, again, social media and other technologies allow us to much more easy nowadays to actually create actual disinformation, deep fakes, made up images, edited images, and then spread them as if they were actual, with kind of high degree of believability.
Lily, can you just explain quickly what a deep fake is? Just because we're talking about it, I want to make sure that people understand the terminology.
Well, maybe Judith would be better at this, but a deepfake is an artificially created image or video. Voice can be associated with it that seems very real, but is not. So artificial intelligence now can help mimic voice, create voices that match the vocal characteristics of the person speaking. And I also listened to a program not long ago about a guy who actually researches scamming using deep fakes, who for 3 months had talked with somebody on the phone, telling them about his research, who he believed was his father. Because it was, and this is a researcher in the field.
Wow.
Because it was uncanny, the conversation. So a deep fake, when it comes to something like, making up a speech video of a politician or something like that, would be an example of disinformation. There is nothing real about it, but it draws enough on what might seem factual, like the appearance of the person or their vocal characteristics, to make it believable. And it's distributed with the intent to provoke or coalesce a certain group of people around an ideology or something like that.
And what makes that super tricky is that we're really bad at processing information as humans. We rely on heuristics or shortcuts, right? So if you sound like my mom, then you're my mom. I'm not going to listen for evidence that you're actually not my mother. And that applies to political information too. If I see a news story come across my social media feed that matches how I view reality, I'm far less likely to want to check it or verify it than if I see something that I don't believe, because we have a lot of information coming at us every day. And so we have to figure out shortcuts to make sense of all of that. And sometimes that leads to us falling for deepfakes or believing disinformation and spreading it as misinformation.
Got it. Okay. So I think one of the things that we need to make sure that we're sharing is that this happens on all sides. Yes, I am biased and feel that this is happening like egregiously on the right, but that's my bias, right? And that's my perception of what's going on. But it can happen in any situation, and it can be misinformation or disinformation. So in this conversation, we are not judging. We are talking about facts. And obviously, people can assume it's happening on the other person's side more than on our sides. But can you speak to that dynamic and how we prevent ourselves? I guess you just spoke to this a little bit, Judith, with like, oh, because I assume that this is inaccurate, I'm going to go look and find out if it's inaccurate, right? But how do we prevent ourselves from assuming that what we hear and know is obviously right and somebody else's information is obviously wrong? Is there a way to prevent that in some way? Or like, are there ways to fact check everything? How do we do this? Because this is so complicated and frankly terrifying that we live in this age where we don't know what's true.
I mean, I can give a very workshop-based answer, and I'm hoping Lily can maybe fill in the blanks a little bit. What I tell folks to do when I teach workshops is figure out what news organizations you like, look them up on something called a media bias chart, and then find news organizations on the opposite end of that chart and check what they say about that same topic. There's this awesome website called All Sides, where you can put your story, whatever news story you're reading, and it will tell you what its leaning is it's left leaning or if it's right leaning. And then it will also present you with the same news story from a more center-based outlet, as well as an outlet from the other end of the spectrum. So that really allows you to see, I know, and sometimes I will not be aware of my own bias until I go on All Sides and I'll go, oh, wow, okay. So it's work, right? I mean, like my mom said when I was a kid, take everything with a grain of salt, first of all. And
right. Which is why you are where you are. And this is why you do what you do. You're like, my profession is taking things with a grain of salt.
Right. And, but there are ways to formalize that. And just, if something sounds like, oh my God, this has to be true, well, then maybe check it because it might not be. I mean, but that's a very cut and dry answer. And
yeah, I will provide that website. So you said All Sides. Is it allsides.com?
Allsides.com. Yep.
Got it. And then the media bias charts, is there a specific place to find those? Great. So everybody, that will be in the show notes for you and on the webpage. Great. That's really helpful to understand. And what a good exercise. I know a lot of times it's like, make sure you talk to someone on the other side or make sure you're looking at all the sides. And now we actually have a resource that will help us to look at things from multiple sides. So thank you for that. Lily, is there anything you wanted to add to that? I know that Judith was like, you can fill in the blanks.
Well, All Sides is a great resource. I also use it. And I think it's a quicker way to slow ourselves down. Where I would say is like, the important thing is to slow ourselves down. When we think about misinformation and disinformation, I think that we think about this moment of when something makes its public appearance. But slowing ourselves down would mean to recognize that all of these news items or social media posts exist in connected ways. So nothing is a one thing. Nothing is discrete in that way. They're all interconnected. So to ask them, okay, like, when did I first hear this? Even if there are questions that we can ask ourselves. Who else has been talking about this thing? In what ways they are talking? And so on. So in this, like, rather than jumping to, oh yeah, that's true or that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that like having a concrete resource like All Sides is one way to do that. We can also just have a set of questions that we remind ourselves to ask ourselves when we interact with something, including what is factual about this. Like in the example with Springfield, Ohio, it is fact that there are Haitian immigrants, right? So there, for something to kind of have this appeal and to be able to grow into disinformation, it almost always has something truthful in it as well. It has that grain of truth. It has something factual. And then the rest, the lies, kind of relate to that factual element. So to ask, what are the facts? What is it that I know is actually factual? And then who else has something to say about this fact? So then people can look up information from immigrant rights organizations in Springfield, Ohio, or they can look information from the mayor, which is something that has been brought up quite a bit because apparently they have commented, local politicians and government officials have commented on this issue quite a bit. So that gives some of these other perspectives.
Great. But that also requires that people want to know if it's true or not, right? There's this step of like, okay, I'm hearing this thing. Then you have to ask, is it possible that this isn't true? But it does require that people are taking that step of asking that question, which I think is important. And that sort of begs the question, what is this doing to our culture? You know, I hear you talking, Judith, about the 6:30 news with Walter Cronkite. Like I grew up, I'm in this Zennial generation in between where like I grew up, I did not have cable. We watched the news at 6:30. We got internet, you know, in high school. And so I'm in this in-between generation that I'm watching this transformation happen, as are all of you. And what is this doing to us? There are endless places that we can get news, especially if we're on social media. But also last week, I was chatting with Catherine Stewart, who's an expert in Christian nationalism, and learned a lot about like these huge Christian media networks that I did not know about. And so there's not just ABC, CBS, and NBC. There's a multitude of channels and massive media conglomerations. And so what is it doing to us that it seems the more options there are to consume information, the more potential information there is that we could consume?
Right. I do want to, because we tend to talk about the past as though it was always better. And we also know that's very much not the case. So I do want to say that, the media age of Walter Cronkite was great, but it was also an age where certain voices were privileged over others, right? And it took the birth of social media to give voice to movements like Black Lives Matter, like Me Too. And I think that that's really important to know. Like we don't necessarily need to go back to the era of the three networks.
Right.
But, so what we're seeing all these niche networks, right? Niche community organizations and niche social media spaces, which is, not to sound again too Pollyanna, but it's really wonderful for voices that have been previously so marginalized, that didn't have a space where they were heard or seen or given any sort of airtime. So for folks who are in marginalized communities, it's a good thing because they can now find their spaces. At the same time, that also means that we're super fragmented. So there's these Christian media networks that apparently none of us on this call are aware of. And maybe we are in networks that those folks are not aware of. So we're an extremely fragmented society. So what that probably means is that we actually know less and less about what people unlike us are doing. And that makes it harder to relate to people. And this is a tad outside my area of expertise, but I do wonder if we no longer know people who are not like us, and it becomes harder to relate to them, do we dig in our heels more, right? We also live in times where folks really are afraid of what's going to happen. People feel a lot of insecurity. And when you have a high level of uncertainty and you yourself need closure, you're more likely to dig your heels in and not want to expose yourself to things that might make you more insecure. So you're more likely to look for information that confirms what you already know. So even though it's hard for people to expose yourself to your own bias in what you look at, I do think that's really important if we want to move ahead as a society.
Yeah, It is so important. Lily, I know you're really fascinated with sort of how this plays out psychologically for people and how it affects communities. And so what happens to a community or group of people when misinformation or disinformation is utilized, and how does that affect the community?
Can I go back a bit on what?
Yes, of course, please.
I think an important, this is really important that there are now so many more channels in which diverse voices can participate on their own terms too, not set up by what is considered to be this and that, right or wrong. But at the same time, and within our field, we talk about citizen journalism, and for the last decade or so, ever since social media became more accessible, I think that has been a big term. But one of the things that I think kind of was left behind was a set of journalistic standards, which would require checking, fact checking on biases, being explicit about perspective, and so on. So I do think that there is a lot to value about this just range of ways we interact with our worlds and share that with others. And then there is also something to retain or maybe strengthen or consider how it would be present in the current context. And that is, how do we check? This is where I think about this, slowing down a little bit and being really intentional about. And yeah, you're right, Devin. If people don't want to do it, they won't do it because, as Judith said, it's more comfortable. When we feel threatened, why would you want to basically go and poke in your own wound even further? Right?
So true. Yeah.
But I think that if as society, we might be committed to some form of the truth and some form of civic engagement and connection, then that is something we have to do.
Right. And what I've been thinking about a lot lately is we talk about truth a lot, but what I really think we need to center is relationships. Because
preach.
Well, oftentimes, right, especially when we talk about countering misinformation, one of the first things we tell people, or I tell people, is prioritize the relationship. What do you have in common with this person? And even if someone is on the total opposite end of the spectrum, they share basic desires and fears with you. They want a safe future for their children. They want a world in which they can go to the beach and swim and not have to worry about a tsunami. And so go back to what do we all have in common, and then consider why does this person believe this thing that I think is wrong? Right? So I think truth matters, assuming there is a truth, and let's not go there because we'll be here for another 8 hours. But what matters more is understanding where the other person comes from. And on social media, everything is 8 seconds long, 140 characters long. It's always super short. It's very performative. It's very much about look at who I am rather than trying to connect with people. And so sometimes I think that we lose the ability to connect with folks because we're so focused on looking a certain way and appearing a certain way and being seen as a member of a certain group.
Yeah. Very important.
My jam.
That's totally your jam. Totally.
Yeah, I love that. And Lily, I want to hear what you have to say, but I just want to speak to, so I did this episode where I was talking to my uncle who has very different views than I do. And we had to keep coming back to okay, we have very different versions of the truth. We live in very different realities. And that was the most concerning part for me, far and away, of the entire conversation was wow, how do we live in such completely different realities? And what we're consuming and what we're hearing is so different. And so there can't necessarily be connection when we're not coming from the same facts, but there can be connection when we're talking about the same things, or here's what I care about, or I care about you, and we can connect in these ways. But I do worry a bit about, are we going down a road where we're not going to be able to connect with one another because we have such different versions of what's going on that it's so polarizing, which I think maybe we're already at that point, but I want to be able to come back from that. So anyways, Lily, I'm happy to hear what you want to share about all of this. And
just related to this is, I think that connection or relationship and sameness are not the same thing.
Right. Correct.
Difference is not the opposite of connection. I think the difference is necessary for connection. And being connected doesn't mean that we obscure those differences, but rather figure out a way how we can hold space for them, how we can hold space for each other with our differences. Yes, I could care about the well-being of our children, and you could care the same way, about have similar values and care about the well-being of children in general. And we may have very different ways in which that materializes. Somebody might be taking them to sports and somebody else might be keeping them home. Just to take two very benign and dichotomous examples, right? So I think then an opportunity in there is to understand, well, how come, you came to believe that keeping your child at home is taking care of them the best you can, but also believing that for this person, this is the best they can, right? And not trying to argue, no, my best is better than your best.
Yes.
Being able to hold both of those together and then learn how those differences were shaped and what do they mean to a person and so on.
There's a Dutch term that we use, boterwaarde, which translates to toddler truths, things that you believe are inherently true and everybody else also must think is true. And I think part of growing up is realizing, oh, that's actually not a truth. That is just a toddler truth. That is something that I think is true and I think should apply to everybody. And, and a lot of the time, what we do in college here, what Lily and I do, is we try to teach students, okay, that's like your truth. And it's a valuable one, but it's not the truth for everybody. And I think that's something that we sometimes forget, right? That it's true for us. It doesn't have to be true for someone else.
Right.
Academically, there is a term for this, of course. Oh, there's probably more than one term. Okay. One of the terms is a rhetorical vision. Communities share rhetorical vision. It's how we imagine the world functions, what our values are within this, what our place is, and so on. And curiously, but also obviously enough, rhetorical visions are created by circulating stories, certain messages, and then by those stories resonating with people who then continue to pass them on. We see this on social media. You talked about it earlier quite a bit. Oh, this rings true to me. So sure, I'm going to send to everyone to know that FEMA's not doing their job in North Carolina, And by doing this, we continue to build and affirm that particular rhetorical vision, that particular toddler truth. And that kind of then creates what Judith called earlier the echo chambers, or creates those silos. And then unless we are really mindful about saying, hey, I know that this is true for me, but also I know that it's constructed. That doesn't make it any less true, but it just means that it was created. And so I can be curious about how somebody else's world was created. And through that, I think we stand to be connected with one another.
I have a question for Lily, actually, because I'm not a rhetorician.
Great.
I have a total social science background. So I know, but you're more of a rhetorician than I am. So I am curious, right? Because you talk about rhetorical vision that we create in a community. So in online spaces, the space itself is entirely constructed by the people who live in it. But in a real life community, quote unquote, right? Like Bangor, Maine or Portland, Maine, we have streets and trees and sewers and rivers. And those communities have a structure that exists to some degree outside of whether we're there or not. Yeah. Are rhetorical visions shaped by the way in which the space in which the community exists is created? Am I making sense?
Yes, of course. Okay. It's like how we navigate this space.
Yes.
But also it's kind of a mutual shaping relationship.
Right.
We shape the space, not that we would move the river, but some people do that, build channels, all about that.
The Netherlands is all we do. We just move river.
But what the river means to us or how we interact with it.
Right.
And then that becomes our part of rhetorical vision and it changes what the river actually is. It doesn't change, well, in some cases it can literally change the chemical composition of the river.
Accurate.
But, so, like the space changes, shapes our rhetorical vision, but then also how we interact with it continues to shape that space. Right. And it's just kind of this mutual constitution.
So then if there's a physical space that we exist in, it might be easier to create a shared rhetorical vision across different socioeconomic groups.
Space.
Yeah, but in an online space, you have the ability to just exclude people who don't think like you. So then it's harder to create a shared rhetorical vision across a diverse community, right?
And back to your earlier point about insecurities and fears, because there is a reason for community. Community is protective, and we all have this need for connection. And so especially when we might feel threatened, and those threats, whether they're real or propagandized, is that a word?
Yes.
They feel real to us, right? So then we might tend to want to be closer within the protected community.
Right.
I think there is a story, it was popular some time ago. There is a book about it, but I like the telling of it in a book called The Healing Power of Human Connection in a Sometimes Lonely World. It's written by Dr. Vivek Murthy, who is the Surgeon General of the United States, and he has declared loneliness an epidemic. But this has been kind of his program. But in the book, he recalls the story of Derek Black, and there is a separate book all about Derek Black. I just like his telling of it.
Okay.
Derek Black grew up. He's a nephew of a Grand Wizard of the KKK. He grew up like very high. He and his father ran Storm, whatever, a very conspiracy theory, racist radio show and a blog and so on. And he tells the story of how what he knew. So this is about these rhetorical visions and communities and how disinformation and misinformation can feel like truth and can bond us. So what he knew of the KKK is that they were a very loving community. He was loved. They would travel places, and there would always be members of this community who were strangers who would open their doors to them and welcome them. And his interpretation from that of kind of racist beliefs was simply that a separation is better for everybody. That it is not so much about hatred or inequity or anything, or even white supremacy. It was simply that everybody would live better if they can create their own world and do things their own way within their own world. And that's kind of created with a loving vision. I think that's very difficult for me to, be like, sure.
Right.
But so what happened with Derek Black is that he went to college in Florida, and his roommate was Jewish. And his roommate continued to repeatedly invite him to Sabbath dinners. And although he was known, nobody really confronted him about his affiliations and so on. And gradually, through conversations and the trust, his friends' trust that he is a person who can change what they believe, who can change the communities they're a part of. He did change, and he would still talk about, though, how he can have this difference, very now vast difference with his family, and he still can have the connection with them. He still goes home. He knows where he goes home to. He knows that his views are very different now. But he also has this kind of understanding of how there was comfort in them and how his version of, I don't know if that all made sense. But kind of the point that I'm trying to make is that in the bigger picture, again, not in the moment of saying the factual or infactual thing, not in the argument of whether it's correct or incorrect, but in the bigger picture, we share information, we exchange information and share stories for the purpose of connection. And that could be done nefariously, but it could also really, in most cases, be done with this, like, well, we need this bond, we need this group, and this is how we make the group be.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds so much like you're both talking about the necessity of connecting and being in relationship, and also opening yourself up and saying, I want to connect with you, even though we have different views, or maybe because we have different views, even like going a step farther and saying, what is going to help us moving forward? And this is what I believe as a minister and someone who is obsessed with connection as our healing path forward, is that we have to connect with people and share our stories and share ourselves and share who we are, because it will help to dispel the fear that people have of us, and it will help us dispel the fear we have of them. Because if we can actually connect and be in community, we can actually come together and maybe find some middle ground, some way to connect, and some way to sort of repair all of this disconnection that is so rampant in our world. So I love what you've both shared. Is there anything else that either of you would like to add to this conversation around misinformation, disinformation, media, disconnection, fragmentation of our experience and our consumption of information and how it affects us?
I just do want to say that I see the value. So again, I would draw on this book by Dr. Murthy. He gives this metaphor of culture, which generally translates to individualistic and collectivistic cultures, but he thinks of culture as a bowl, a vessel of sorts. And he talks about a third bowl of culture. And that is one where we have opportunity for individual self-expression, individualization, and kind of like honoring our uniqueness, but also have pockets of connections. And what I want to emphasize about this is that those pockets don't necessarily have to always come together also. I think there is value to having some degree of, I don't know what to call it, a protected space. You know, Indigenous community needs an Indigenous space, and we don't necessarily need to always want to be there. That doesn't mean we also cannot function as residents of Bangor, which is another kind of community where those differences can be present. And so not to try to collapse all of the spaces into one big.
Right. No, that would not work.
I think for me, what is an important takeaway every time is that we also have to be careful not slide into complete relativism. Right. I mean, we've sat here and said everybody has a different truth and information, and it's this and that, and it's a continuum. But there are some things that we as a society agree on are right and wrong. Like we agree murder's wrong, right? And then we disagree on the ins and outs of that. So I do think that in this discussion about misinformation and fake news and disinformation, we need to be careful that we don't turn it into a anything goes, because we as a society have agreed that not everything goes, and that there are things that we will as a society or as a community stand up against or stand up for. And I think we need to not connect to folks with the intention of winning, right? And sometimes I wonder, are our conversations about being right, or are they about, hey, what's going on in your life?
Right.
I'm guilty of this, right? We want to all matter. We want to all matter, but we can also matter just by being. And we don't have to be right. We can just be.
Yeah, absolutely. During my many conversations on this podcast, I have brought up the very famous Ted Lasso quote of be curious, not judgmental. And then actually when I was, sort of preparing myself emotionally for my conversation with my uncle, I kept sort of saying to myself, like, connect, don't correct.
Right.
Like, it's not about correcting everybody. It's about connecting with people. And that's hard. It's not always easy, especially when you're like, oh my gosh, this is totally wrong what you're saying. But then it's like, well, is it? I need to make sure that's true. There's so many questions. I guess I have one last question for both of you, which is, do you see a path forward where this might shift, right? Like this sort of rampant nature of misinformation, disinformation, perceptions of the truth, so many things and ways for people to consume. Do you see anything, sort of moving forward or ways moving forward that this could shift to there not being so much division?
I mean, historically, when we look at trends, I would say yes. I mean, this is not the first era of fake news or misinformation, right? The yellow newspaper era was very well known for all the false stories that it spread.
Sorry, what is the yellow newspaper era? I don't know that.
The yellow era took place in the late 1800s. It really started with a battle for readers between Pulitzer and Hearst. If you've seen the musical Newsies, it kind of
yes, of course,
the yellow era. So this is where
sensationalism is what mattered the most.
Exactly, so, not truth.
Got it.
We came back from that.
Relevant.
We came back from that, right? So it's often a pendulum. And you are hearing pushback. The fact that you are doing this podcast is a sign that there's pushback. The fact that Maine Calling is doing news stories on this, people are also very tired of it. So I do see a way forward and past this. I'm not sure what it looks like, but I am confident we'll get there.
Good.
So I think one of the things that we agree on as society is that there is a place of some sort of regulation. I mean, it's not a complete anarchy.
No.
And so I think one of the lessons, again, of history that we learn, and I also am with Judith on this, yes, I think I do see a path of things changing. And again, history would teach us that some sort of regulation comes. Mm-hmm. So this is one of the places where it's handled differently in different places around the world, but understanding more not only what misinformation and disinformation are, but how they impact societies, I think would also motivate corporations to, together with governments, to think about how we better regulate that in service of our civic responsibility.
Yeah, good. I totally agree with that because there's an ethical responsibility there that I think is so important. So thank you both so much for all of the information that you have provided. This has been a very rich and interesting conversation. Everybody that's listening, I am going to put in the show notes wherever you get your podcasts, but also on the webpage that is specifically for this episode, information and resources and links, including Vivek Murthy's book and all kinds of things that will help you moving forward. And that also potentially you can provide those resources to people who you don't agree with and be like, hey, I'm using this resource to check my stories and to also get different sides of stories. And so maybe you might want to look at that also. So that could be a really great resource. I appreciate you both so much for being here. Thank you. And I'll see you later.
All right.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of The Connected Way. You can find all the resources mentioned in the show and even more resources in the show notes and on the podcast page at theconnectedway.com/podcast. Before you go, a note about sponsorship. This podcast is currently sponsored by me, Rev Dev, and you, the listeners. If you're interested in supporting the podcast and the work of The Connected Way, enhancing individual and collective connection to self, others, the land, and spirituality, you can donate on the podcast webpage. There is never any pressure or expectation, but if you feel called to support the work, any contribution of any amount helps, as do your good thoughts. And finally, I'd love to hear your biggest takeaway from today's show. What inspired you? What surprised you or made you think? Let me know by posting a comment on any of the posts or DMing me on Instagram, or of course, you can always send me a message on the website. Thanks again for being here, friends. May this podcast bring more connection to you and the collective. And so it is. See you next time.